This is Law Bites, a podcast with Michael Geist.
Écoutez, sur la question des...
Well, look, when it comes to hyperlinks, that is a very interesting question. Originally, I excluded it because, to me, a link is just an address. But of course, sometimes there are contextual components that come along with the address, and those would deliver some of the substance. For example, if the title were included in the hyperlink. I've heard many comments and received criticism on that point, and I would be quite comfortable to modify it to include hyperlinks in the bill.
Earlier this year, Senator Claude Carignan introduced Bill S-225, a bill that purports to address concerns about the viability of the Canadian media sector by amending the Copyright Act. The bill for the moment excludes hyperlinks, as well as an insubstantial portion of the work, which led me to post that this was a copyright bill that really does nothing. But as you just heard, the senator is now even considering adding hyperlinks to the mix. The Senate has been studying the bill in recent weeks, with Senator Paula Simons serving as the bill critic and one of the leads on the issue. Senator Simons was a longtime journalist before being appointed to the Senate, and while an ardent supporter of local journalism, she's been critical of the proposed legislation. She joins me on the podcast to discuss the state of journalism in Canada, why she doesn't think social media companies stole stories from the media, and what Canada should be doing to encourage innovation in the media sector. Senator Simons, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Why don't we start, for those that aren't familiar with your background, we're going to be talking obviously about the Senate bill that deals with copyright, the news sector, social media companies, but you've had many, many years of experience in journalism before becoming a senator. Can you describe a bit that experience before you became a senator?
Sure. I was appointed to the Senate in October of 2018. And before that, I had spent 30 years as a working journalist. Like many a Canadian journalist, I've done a little bit of everything. I got my very earliest start in private radio. I worked for magazines. I spent 6 years as a radio producer with the CBC, but I spent the last 23 years of my career as a reporter, investigative journalist, and eventually political columnist with the Edmonton Journal, and a fair bit of magazine freelance work along the way. So I've done TV, radio, magazine, newspapers, podcasting, done it all.
Okay, so you really are the perfect person, I think, to come and talk about these issues. And for anyone that even doubts it before they've even listened to this, they should take the time to watch the really what I thought was a must-watch speech that you gave critiquing the Senate bill that purports to address the concerns around the news sector and social media companies. But I thought that you did a really good job both of highlighting the challenges, but also talking about some of the shortcomings in the policy proposal. Why don't we start with the problems in the sector right now? Because I think it's undeniable that there are challenges. You talked a bit about how things have changed for the Canadian media. Can you talk a bit about those changes and what you attribute to the decline in fortune?
Sure. When I got my start in media, I did not realize that it was the golden age. You always think the golden age happened before you showed up. But, the story I like to tell is that when I arrived at the Edmonton Journal newsroom in 1995, the building was so full that the newsroom, you didn't get your own desk. You sat someplace for the morning, and then the afternoon shift came in and took that desk. And the assignment editors assigned so many stories they couldn't possibly all fit in the paper, although the paper was a great big fat doorstop of a thing, so that you had to compete for news hole. And we thought that was normal. I mean, the newsroom, if anything, was overstaffed. It was a remarkable time to be a reporter. But over the 23 years that I worked at the paper, it shrank and shrank and shrank and shrank and shrank. And you can see the exact fault line. It happens in 2005. And that is the year that people really start moving to digital advertising. And what I noted in my speech is over that time from 2005 till 2019, the newspaper industry lost $2.5 billion in advertising. It started with the collapse of classified ads, which nobody really understood how important classified ads were to the daily newspaper. They brought in, about $1 billion in revenue to daily newspapers across Canada a year. And one day those classified ads were just all gone. Gone to Kijiji, gone to Craigslist, gone to various other smaller online portals. And after the classifieds, they came for the local advertising. And once all of that had disappeared to the digital realm, newsrooms started frantically cutting. And I used to liken it to being on a life raft in the North Atlantic where it's really cold and you want to send up flares so that somebody can see you. So you cut the logs off the end of the light raft to build a fire. And this seems like a really good strategy until you have taken all the logs and burned them, and there's no life raft left anymore. And that's really what media companies across Canada, across North America, across the Western world have done. They've slashed and slashed and slashed their staffs until there's almost no one left in newsrooms. And then readerships decline, subscriptions go down, advertisers walk away, and so it becomes a snake eating its tail. You cannot cut your way back to profitability.
Yeah, no, you've highlighted both the classified ad impact, the broader impact, and that shift to ad dollars. We'll talk about digital advertising a little bit later. But one of the other factors that you point to is competition. That at one point in time, many of the local paper, so to speak, had what felt like a monopoly position in their local market, and that's no more.
Yeah,
Can you talk a bit about that?
You had a geographic monopoly because if you lived in Regina or Fredericton or Victoria, where there was only one newspaper, or even, in Edmonton or Calgary or Winnipeg, or Ottawa, where there were two, I mean, the newspaper had a geographic monopoly. You could not go online to read things. So you read things in your daily newspaper. That was where you read your stories. If you wanted to know what was going on in your community, the daily newspaper was where you turned. And if you wanted to advertise and reach local consumers, the local newspaper was where you put your advertising dollars. And so for a lot of big city, not big city newspapers, a lot of large newspapers in medium-sized cities, it was almost a license to print money. I mean, the Edmonton Journal, when I was working there in the early 2000s, was, for a time at least, the most profitable paper in the chain. And, I remember when the newspaper celebrated its 100th birthday, the paper rented out the Winspear Center, the big concert hall. It's like, for your listeners in Ottawa, it's sort of the size of the National Arts Center, rented out the entire concert hall for an enormous party where there was, fabulous catered food on every level, and all the advertisers came, and Michael Bublé performed a concert just for Journal staff and advertisers. I mean, there was so much money. And then poof, one day it was gone.
Incredible. As part of that one day it was gone, obviously today much of the focus is on the role that the platforms played. But, one of the most striking things that I thought you said in that talk was, with respect to the platforms, they didn't steal our stories, we gave it to them. How did that play out?
Well, when the internet was new and all, we were so excited to be able to share our content. We thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. We would be able to get our stories in front of more eyes, not just our local readers in the paper. But, for me as a columnist, it was really exciting. If my column got shared on Facebook or Twitter, it meant that potentially thousands of people across the country could read it. And so that was wonderful for my ego. But at first we were very cautious about it. I remember that the paper actually had a rule at one point that none of my columns were allowed to be tweeted out. Even though I was on Twitter as a journalist, I wasn't allowed to tweet links to my columns because the paper believed, very flatteringly, again to my ego, that people would buy the paper on purpose to read my column. And I remember being really angry and fighting with them and saying, no, 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 if I want to reach new readers, young readers, I have to be online. And so we were very keen to we didn't think of it as giving our stories away, because we believed the newspaper would still make lots of money on advertising and subscription. And we thought that this was a way to promote the paper, to get more people to subscribe and to get more people to advertise. So we were very excited to have our stuff on Twitter and Facebook. And we would go to classes internally to learn how to write search engine optimized headlines and leads, so that Google News or Apple News or Microsoft, all of them would be more likely to pick up and share our content. And we didn't think about paywalls. We thought that, we really thought it was like a loss leader, that, we would sort of put these shiny stories in the window, and that would drive people to subscribe to the paper. This was a miscalculation.
It was, and clearly it's had an impact. Can you talk a bit? I want to get into sort of some of the proposals to try to address that. But what do you see as the impact from the loss of local journalism?
We have lost something that we're frankly never going to get back. The days when the newspaper was the one point of call for readers and advertisers are gone. And what we've lost is a real sense of community connection and a shared community cultural literacy. There was a time when I could legitimately say that everyone in Edmonton read the Edmonton Journal. They didn't all read it the same way. Some people only read the sports section. Some people only read the food section. Some people only read the comics. But there was a shared sense of community connection and involvement. The paper was the touchstone, the template. It was the shared source of knowledge about what was going on in your community, what was going on at your local school board, what was going on at your local city council, what was going on with the drainage, what was going on with the bus routes. And it was where everybody came together. Our letters page sometimes used to spill over because people were so involved and felt so connected and felt such a pride in their local paper. And once we fractured the information universe into thousands of tiny shards, people weren't interested in that broad general issue newspaper. It's a little bit like the death of the department store. When I was growing up, Woodward's, because I'm from the West, Woodward's and Eaton's and the Bay, you went and everything you wanted was at the Bay. Everything you wanted was at Woodward's. You could buy a Chesterfield, you could buy a television, you could buy children's toys, you could buy, women's fancy clothing, you could get, groceries. You could get everything at the Woodward's. The newspaper was like that big department store. And just as people have stopped shopping in department stores, they have stopped wanting to read a general interest publication that gives them a broad overview of what's going on in their community. They want to be micro-targeted. They seek out stories that appeal to their very particular interests. Everybody's in silos. Everybody's in their little, their little bubbles, talking to the people who think the way they do, seeking out the news that conforms to their pre-existing ideas of the world. We thought that Twitter and Facebook were going to give us all of the information, that it was going to be like a digital library of Alexandria. We would be able to know everything. In point of fact, that kind of information anarchy, that cacophony of information, the torrent of information that kept pouring down on us was overwhelming for people. And so over time, it's not just a question of the algorithms, although the algorithms make it possible. People were not interested in swimming in the deep sea of all the information the internet had to offer. More and more and more, they sought out the little, the tide pools, the shallow shoals, where they were comfortable and where they could see the stories and the information that played to their existing prejudices and their existing worldviews.
Yeah, no, you paint such a dynamic picture at that point in time, and sure, I have a similar kind of recollection growing up in Toronto of my local paper. So there were several, but it was that same kind of relationship. I have to say, with all of that, with your background and experience and clear love for for the sector and the importance that you've ascribed to it, I think one would have thought that you would be, the poster person for a Senate bill that seeks to try to address the issue. In this case, purportedly by using copyright to require payments by social media services. But here you are as the critic for the bill. Why don't we start? I'd like to get into some of those criticisms. Why don't we start with the notion that the bill misunderstands digital advertising, which is one of the points that you raise in your speech. How so?
Well, I mean, the bill sort of begins, its foundational premise is that newspapers are being robbed of advertising revenue because these big media platforms, Google, Facebook, Apple, are stealing the stories and monetizing them. So the paradigm on which this is based is that once upon a time, we sold the ads on those stories, and now Facebook, Google, Twitter are selling ads based on our copy. Well, that's a tiny bit true, but that's not really the fundamental problem. Facebook is not getting rich by selling ads against our stories. They're getting rich by selling ads against your aunt's cat video or, your cousin's anti-vax ranting. Facebook wants engagements, and news stories make up, they claim anyway, for take that with a grain of salt for what it's worth, that news stories make up only about 5% of the content that's being shared on their platforms. So, you begin with this kind of, I don't want to call it a paranoid fantasy, because paranoid, that's unkind. That's not what I mean at all. But you sort of begin with a misapprehension that the reason that local newspapers are suffering is because the social media platforms are stealing our stories and the advertising dollars that are attached to those stories. That's not true. They've stolen our first of all, I should stop saying our, since I'm not a member of the working press anymore. But it's not that they've stolen the content in the first place. The news organizations have given and indeed begged them to take the content. But the advertising revenues are not coming from monetizing the stories. They're coming because Google and Facebook offered cheaper, better targeted ads. So, you want to advertise for your little thing, for your big thing. Facebook and Google can tell you exactly who's clicking on the ad. They can send it to exactly, you want to advertise to women between the ages of 35 and 45 who have school-aged children and an interest in tennis. Facebook can find those exact people for you. No newspaper can compete with that. No newspaper ever could, whether online or in print.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. It's one that I've been making as part of this debate as well. And this content is exceptionally important. It's everything. If you're a media organization, if you're a social media service or a search engine, it's one of a myriad of pieces of content that people are sharing and isn't all that economically important at the end of the day, which is why I would argue why when we've seen some of those companies arguably engaging in ill-advised threats or statements that they're going to leave a market if they're forced to do this from an economic perspective, I think it's actually an understandable position. It might not be tenable from a broader political perspective, but economically one can understand why they might make that case. You also delve into copyright, talking about hyperlinks and fair dealing, and conclude, I think rightly, that it just doesn't apply here. And in this case, these kinds of issues around hyperlinks and headlines and all this sort of content takes on, I think, an even a greater import when the Senator Carignan, who's sponsored this, has now said, well, maybe I should have included links. Maybe links even ought to be factored in as well. Can you talk a little bit about the copyright analysis that you've engaged in, or the thinking that you have with respect to how copyright applies or perhaps doesn't apply in the context of news sharing this way?
All right. I have to say, there are two of us in this conversation. Dr. Geist, one of us is an internationally acclaimed expert in copyright law, and the other one is me. So I am now going to embarrass myself by explaining to you, a guy who's written a bunch of books on copyright, how copyright works. So here I go. So Senator Guérignon's bill divides copyright into two things. So he's, as I don't need to tell you, Canadian journalists own the copyright to their work. If you're a freelancer, you own the copyright until your death, and then your heirs own it for 50 and soon to be 70 years after your death. If you work on staff for a publication, as I did for the Edmonton Journal, then your employer owns the copyright for 50 years after the date of publication. What Senator Guérignon is proposing is that we create a neighboring right, a right to remuneration that would be like a royalty. And he's sort of modeling this on the way music royalties work. So if you think about SOCAN, and you think about, which is the copyright collective that represents Canadian musicians. So you're a musician, you write some songs, you put out a CD, you sell your CD, people buy your CD, and you own the copyright to the music. But you also want people to play your songs, not just at home. You want nightclubs to play your songs. You want restaurants to play your songs. You want gyms to play your songs. And you want radio stations and music streaming services to play your songs. So you get paid a tiny, tiny amount, a tiny little royalty for each time a song is played. And that is how royalties work in the music industry. What Senator Guérignon is proposing is a similar model for print. So his logic is just as, you have to buy a license if you're an aerobic studio. I guess I don't have aerobic studios anymore. I date myself. But, just as you have to buy a license to play music if you're a nightclub, or just as you have to, send a record if you're a radio station of what songs you played, that the big media platforms should pay a royalty for every time they reproduce a story. The challenge is that it's settled Canadian law that sharing a hyperlink does not constitute a republication. So if I tweet a link, I haven't violated anybody's copyright. I've just created an online pointer. It's like a digital footnote that tells people where to go to read the story, and then I send you back to the original source publication. So initially, Senator Guérignon said, all right, we'll exclude hyperlinks, and we'll only apply this royalty if somebody copies and pastes an entire article or a substantial, significant portion thereof. Well, anybody under 50 knows that's not how people share things on social media. I mean, once upon a time, before there was Facebook, sometimes people actually used to do that. They used to just like cut and paste and steal and plagiarize my columns and put them on their websites and their blogs. And then the journal would call them and say, don't do that because we have the copyright. And then they would be cowed and they would take it down. But people really don't share in blocks of text like that anymore. Facebook discourages it by having character limits. And on Twitter, which is the #1 site for sharing news stories, you can't share text like that at all because there's a strict character limit and people share hyperlinks. So initially, Senator Guérignon's bill excluded hyperlinks, and that made sense. But when I asked him about that in a committee hearing, he said, well, maybe we should include hyperlinks. And I was like, no, that wasn't the answer to the question. Don't do that. He said, oh, maybe we should amend the bill to include hyperlinks. And I was like, no, that doesn't actually fix the problem because you can't copyright a hyperlink. And then there's the question of what constitutes a significant or a substantial portion, which is not settled Canadian copyright law. But we do have, fair use, fair dealing rulings, which say that, a bit in context you're allowed to use without violating copyright. I was taken aback when Senator Guérignon suggested that perhaps even reprinting a headline could be a copyright violation. So even sharing a hyperlink with a headline, he said that could be considered a substantial, significant portion of the story. I don't know. You're the copyright expert. What do you make of his argument?
Oh, I must admit, I found it to be a kind of stunning and a bit depressing exchange. You're absolutely right. And the notion that somehow it would be appropriate to say that a rights holder should be able to restrict someone from even pointing to their work, much less copyright such small amounts really creates an enclosure around, in many ways, the English language and expression, which runs so directly counter to the goals of copyright. This is using a tool that is just not fit for purpose with respect to the kinds of behavior that he thinks is taking place. And so I must admit, when I first read the bill, my first response was, well, maybe he just doesn't even understand how social media works in terms of news sharing, because it isn't this, as you say, sharing of full text. And if he's excluded what is essentially fair dealing plus and links, then what's the point? It's not really achieving anything at all. For him to suggest, well, okay, the way to fix that is to just make the enclosure even larger, as you say, is the wrong answer. It's one that I don't think would withstand any sort of scrutiny if it ever go to court, and I think ultimately would harm many of the very players that you're hoping to help, because we all rely on fair dealing. I mean, you talk about kind of competition in the news space. If there's almost a monopoly or exclusivity on that particular kind of expression for whoever reported, let's say, on something first or printed it first, then you lose some of that kind of competition that's really important for the broader public sphere. So
Well,
yes,
and
really
you,
problematic.
And you lose what is actually the good thing about social media. I mean, I've talked a great deal at the beginning of this about how, Twitter and Facebook came and took all our money, boo-hoo. But I mean, what Twitter has done is create a robust, at its best. Sometimes Twitter is at its worst, but some days Twitter is at its best. And when it's at its best, then you get to have those conversations and you get to see, um, you know, politicians and professors of economics and journalists and, smart well-read members of the citizenry engaging in really interesting public policy debate because they can swap ideas, because they can swap information so easily. I mean, the things that sometimes it's easy to forget what we loved about the internet when we were young and naive and idealistic. But it was that free exchange of ideas and information. It was the cross-pollination. And if you hive off the information, you put people even more into bubbles and silos. But, I understand where Senator Carignan is coming from. I mean, he asked me personally to serve as the critic for his bill, and he did so because he knew that I cared as passionately as he did about the future of a news industry that supports democratic engagement and, the free exchange of factual information. And so, I may be taking my role as critic a bit too literally, but his bill, however well-intentioned, doesn't do what he wants it to do. And worse than that, it creates a whole lot of sort of a cascade of unintended consequences. So first of all, he would take away freelancers' rights to the reproduction of their material. And under the bill, a freelancer would have to assign their rights to the publisher and then negotiate for a share of royalties. That, for some of the other copyright experts I spoke to, that's really problematic because instead of supporting independent journalism, you're actually taking existing rights away from rights holders who work on a freelance basis. And then you get into the other unintended consequence, which is, okay, suppose you do put newspapers into copyright collectives and they do negotiate with the big players and they do manage to do what sort of they've done in Australia, which is to bring the big players to the table and force them to negotiate. That, maybe the bill doesn't really do what it sets out to do, but it gets the wind up and the big players like Google and Apple and Facebook say, okay, it's better to cut some kind of deal than to deal with the annoyance, the nuisance that this represents. So who benefits? And, my real concern is that if you look at a site like Google News or Apple News, what you'll see is that it shares primarily stories from the big media players. It's the Globe and Mail, it's the Toronto Star, it's the Toronto Sun, Global, the CBC. And you don't see any stories from newspapers in Penticton or Rimouski or Bathurst or Regina. So who's going to benefit primarily under this model? As Senator Carignan himself acknowledged in committee, it will be the really big players. Because if you get royalties based on how many times people share your stories and you're a small regional daily, you're not going to see benefit from this. And what it will do instead is give the most money to the people who are already the biggest players. And that doesn't help regional media. It doesn't help Francophone media. It doesn't help the people who are really going to need it most.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you raised that aspect of it. I had Jeff Elgie from Village Media on the podcast a number of months ago, talking about innovation in the sector and the fear that the innovative, the new players have is that you embed essentially these legacy players through these kinds of mechanisms, and you don't kind of get to where we need to get to, which is to support innovation across the sector. It's not limited to just new startups. We'd like to see innovation, I think, from all players, but if you establish frameworks that sort of essentially make legacy beholden to these large players and funnel money to them regularly, what happens to innovation in the space? What happens to these startups?
Yeah. So, you get something like The Line or The Sprawl or Saltwire or, lots of, I can't go them all. The Narwhal, the National Observer, all these, they're not even startups anymore. All these digital players, where are they in this? Their whole delivery mechanism relies on being shared on social media. So that's the other thing. You don't really want to give Facebook a reason to say, sorry, we're not sharing Canadian media content anymore, because then you will have really put digital players at a tremendous competitive disadvantage.
Yeah, no.
And then, you get to a more subtler philosophical question. What is the real problem here? There are two. One is that there's not enough advertising revenue to sustain legacy media, or frankly, even to sustain small digital startups. But the other one is a subtler, more philosophical point, which is that we now get most of our news in this country curated for us by American corporations and their algorithms. So who decides what you see in the morning when you fire up your computer or turn on your phone? Not the editor of the Globe and Mail, not the editor of the Edmonton Journal, not the editor of the Vancouver Sun. It's somebody, it's some robot that's deciding what you're going to see. And I think it is a legitimate subject for public policy debate to ask ourselves, to what extent do we surrender our cultural and political sovereignty to the curation of these giant American corporations who have their own political and cultural agendas, so that we do not have sovereignty over what we read. And fundamentally, if S225 actually worked, despite all the questions you and I have raised about it, what it would really do is entrench that symbiotic parasitic relationship so that we would be even more beholden to those major American websites to access our news. So, I'm sure that is not what Senator Carignan intends. I know it isn't. He's brought forward this bill. I think it's a great thing that he's brought this bill forward, because it's making us have this conversation, and it's making people think really hard inside and outside the Senate about what is the nature of the problem and what are the potentials for solutions, and to what extent are we crying for the moon, waiting to go back to the golden age. Michael Bublé is not going to be playing any more command performances for the Edmonton Journal newsroom. Those days are done. So what is our desired end game? What is the goal of a public policy? It can't just be to support big legacy media companies, and it can't just be to create a sort of a feudal relationship with Google and Facebook so that we come to them cap in hand and demand that they underwrite the Canadian news industry just because they're rich. That does not solve our problem of access to information that is in our public interest and not in Mark Zuckerberg's.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah, that's fabulous. It raises, I think, two last questions for you. One, talking about that dependence, we have seen a growing number of news media organizations strike deals with Google and Facebook. Initially in Canada, there were very few, but we started to see a bit more happening now. What do you think of those deals, given what you just said about concerns around dependence on these companies?
Well, it's interesting because just as I was making, literally in the middle of my speech on S225, the news broke that Google had made a deal with a bunch of sort of interesting smaller players, Le Devoir and the Soleil and the Free Press papers, but also Saltwire, TO Blog, The Sprawl, The Narwhal, The National Observer, a bunch of sort of, smaller players who have established a strong critical reputation. And the nature of the deal is a bit vague. Google hasn't said how much they're paying them or sort of on what basis. But the idea was that they would pay some consideration for linking to the specific work that those outlets did on climate change and COVID-19. It's an interesting combination. And maybe it's like some other unspecified topics. So it's great to see those new media organizations and the legacy ones like Le Devoir getting support from Google. Good for them. I don't know how much support it is. I don't know if it's support that is going to make a meaningful, substantive difference to their bottom line. But it does, it strengthens the degree of leverage that Google has over them now and in the future. And, newspapers and news organizations always had to make these deals with their advertisers and their subscribers. I mean, nobody got rich in the newspaper business without giving some consideration to the sensitivities of their readers and the sensitivities of their advertisers. But at least those were local people whom you could, yell at over a boardroom table. And if, as happened, I remember once at the Edmonton Journal, I guess I won't name them because that's mean, but a local substantive advertiser to the Edmonton Journal announced that it was pulling all its advertising because it didn't like some stories the paper had written. And the paper told them basically, fine, suit yourselves, because we're the only game in town. And eventually they came back and placed their advertising. But you could negotiate with your advertisers. How do you negotiate with Google and Facebook if you are so, either you're not dependent upon them and the amount of money they're giving you is de minimis and it's not going to save you, or you're so dependent upon them that you're now in a vassal relationship, and that may be awkward at some point going forward.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. So if there are benefits, but there are some risks with this approach on the licensing side. You've identified the concerns with the bill that's before the Senate right now. It's great that we're having this conversation, but when people ask, well, what do we do? What do you say?
If I knew the answer to this question, I would have had Paul Godfrey's job, and I would have saved Post Media. Everybody thinks they have an answer. Oh, if we just put the newspaper on a tablet. Oh, if we just, create if we just have a casino that runs online next to our newspaper. I mean, I don't blame newspapers and publishing companies for grasping at straws, because they're facing cataclysmic existential collapse. And when you're desperate, desperate times can call for desperate measures. I don't know what the answer is. I do know that once you digitize information, readers don't want to pay for it. And, the number of people who self-righteously tell me that, oh, I would never subscribe to the paper and I would never get a digital subscription. And also I have ad blockers on, but then are mad that the paper doesn't cover the things they want to see covered anymore. And, how come there's so few reporters? Well, if you won't pay for the content, I remember when I first went on social media, and there was a young blogger in Edmonton who wrote a whole essay about how shameful it was that I was still working for the paper, and why didn't I just give away the information for free? And I thought, because I'm paying for my kids' braces. And also, do you think I want to cover city council meetings for you for free? Do you think I do that for fun? If you want good investigative journalism, if you want good coverage of local events that are happening in your community, if you actually want to know what's going on where you live, then I think people are going to have an epiphany where they realize that that doesn't come for free. And I think part of the problem, especially over the last 4 years, is that even people who fancied themselves supporters of the news, well, they went out and got digital subscriptions to the Washington Post and the New York Times so they could obsessively read everything that Donald Trump said and fret over it. You know, now that you can read The Guardian online, and you can read The Economist online, and you can read Le Monde, and you can read, you can read whatever newspaper you want in the world, whatever, you can read BBC and Al Jazeera and what have you. People have sort of become unmoored from the communities in which they live. But I can tell you that The Guardian is never going to cover the issue of your local safe consumption site. And I can tell you that that the Washington Post doesn't care about what's wrong with Ottawa's LRT construction. If you want to know what's happening where you live and you want people to report on it, we're going to have to figure out some way to pay for that. I don't think asking Mark Zuckerberg to do it is necessarily the best answer.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I do wonder, though, implicit in your response just now is perhaps the answer is that, you said people don't want to pay for the news. I must admit, I'm not so sure, because as you said, there are people that, and I'm one of them, that pays for the Washington Post and the New York Times. I also pay for the Globe and Mail and Toronto Star and for the Athletic. And for CART and a whole series of others. I frankly think I spend more now on digital news than I ever did before, when I used to have several papers coming to the door. And that's because there's certain publications that I think are worth paying for. So perhaps isn't that the issue more than anything else, that, the competition that you talked about earlier points to the fact that it isn't so much that people aren't willing to pay. They are, if you show that there's real value, and that with these kind of scraped down enterprises, offering less isn't giving someone a good reason to pay for it.
No, and that is the problem. So it becomes, I'm looking for the right metaphor. Self-fulfilling prophecy doesn't seem quite right. But yes, I mean, as you have set your life raft on fire, log by log, people used to read their local newspaper, not just because of the news, but because they felt a sense of connection to the regular writers. I mean, I remember a time at the Edmonton Journal when we had, food writers who people adored the food writers. I mean, they just worshiped them. They were celebrities. The local film reviewer that people, loved to hate. There were these senses of pride of ownership in the paper, in which people really felt that they were connected not just to the news, but to the people who gave them the news. And once you sever those relationships, it's really hard to build them back up. And, once people have lost that habit, my daughter is 24 and she's super duper smart, and she's a law student at the University of Victoria, and she cares about current affairs. And does she have a subscription to the Victoria Times Columnist? She does not. Did she ever think about getting a subscription to the Victoria Times Columnist? Of course not. She gets her news in other ways. But does she actually know what's going on in the community where she's chosen to go to law school? Not really. Not unless someone shares it on Facebook or Twitter.
I think that experience reflects the experience of many, which is why, why this is really an important discussion and debate. I think some of the solutions are ill-advised, but we do need to be talking about ways to address those broader issues.
Well, and if this bill and this conversation and the debate we're having in the Senate, if this focuses some people's attention, and sometimes. I remember at the paper at one point, they brought in some consultant who said that we had to learn to fail fast. So we had to try different things and then fail at them, and then we would learn that didn't work. The Senate is not a good place for failing fast. Nothing happens fast in the Senate. But it is a good place for trial balloons, and it is a good place to kick around ideas. And that's the gift of the Senate, because we're not tied to an election cycle, because we're not, worried about saving our jobs, 6 months or 2 years from now, whenever that will be. We have the luxury and the responsibility to take controversial ideas and kick them around and play with them and run them up the flag. And I've run out of metaphors and cliches now, but that's why that's one of the reasons you have a Senate, is that we can be sort of this sandbox where ideas get tried out. And if they don't work, well, then that didn't work. But at least we had the discussion of why it might or might not.
Well, I'm glad you're having that discussion, and I'm really glad to have had this discussion. This was a great conversation. Senator Simons, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm a longtime listener, first-time caller. So thank you.
That's the Law Bites podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbites@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBitesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bites podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.